some grievous incident or experience that happens within the context of your relationship, if you don't have that inner capacity, that resiliency, that will to persevere, then you're just going to throw away the baby with the bathwater.
Wow. So welcome to the True Man Podcast. You know, the longer I live and the more wisdom I seek, the more I realize how big a role being in the right mindset is. In fact, I've gotten to the point where I don't really understand why people choose to live with things like anxiety and stress. Now, of course, of particular interest to me is the idea of the lack of masculinity that we see permeating our culture right now, and how some of these men have this misunderstanding of their mindset that they should have. So let's have a conversation about that today. With me is mindfulness coach Bonnie Kowaliuk, and today we are going to talk about the mindfulness in the masculine realm. So Bonnie, thank you for being on the True Man Podcast.
Well, thank you, Mike, for inviting me. I appreciate that very much, and it's a pleasure. And thanks for that lovely introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bonnie, tell us, how did you get started in this mindfulness arena?
It's a bit of a journey. It's not for the faint of heart by any means. And I think my journey began and was inspired by the trials and tribulations I had raising my own son, and noticing how he was struggling when he started entering the school system, and he, definitely, falls on the spectrum, a very bright young man, but also struggles with a lot of attentional issues and anxiety and everything else that comes with kind of falling on the spectrum that way. So, I was adamant I didn't want him to be dumbed down and drugged up, and I wanted to really look into alternative ways to support his brain health and his overall wellness and well-being in terms that would optimize his development as he grew up. So, I started dabbling into different things, looked at nutrition and diet and supplements, and looked at definitely looking at things like guided meditation, certain prescribed music programs, definitely, engaging him with physical activity was a big part of it. So really looking at his whole lifestyle diet, if you want to call it that, and really looking at, where can we fine tune that so that would help support his capacity to stay more focused, to be engaged with his learning, and socially to be able to be developing at a normal rate of development. Because I don't know if you know it or not there, Mike, but men's brains or boys' brains tend to integrate much later than women's do, in terms of when they're really wiring and firing their full capacity.
Some men's brains never kick in at all, I think.
Yeah. Well, some of their, it's true. But really, it can take upwards to 33 years of age before a man's brain is fully developed. So needless to say, my son really inspired me to look at some other ways of supporting his overall healthy development and his mental health in particular. Because, I noticed, how anxious he would become, in certain situations where there wasn't that routine and that consistency, which provided that safer container for him to learn and cope and adapt, right? And unfortunately, he, learned some, poor ways of coping. And, part of it is, it's very interesting, in terms of the male kind of bonding and connecting, from the time, young boys reach manhood. But there's a lot of, I noticed there was a lot of shaming that goes on relative to men that want to embrace their sensitivity, their vulnerability, their authenticity. And, as a result of that, what I noticed over the years was that, my son became, what I call armored up. He literally, in his effort to try to cope and manage, the whole socialization
Yeah.
aspect of becoming a young man, he had to suppress a lot of his innate, traits or
Yeah.
qualities that were actually gifts. I mean, the kid is, amazingly, intuitive and really has a lot of emotional intelligence, but, he never, that wasn't supported, within the school system, and if anything else, if, he, had an emotional reaction or response or moved into, say, overwhelm and would get stressed right out, his brain would literally go offline. And I mean, that's what all the, the brain experts in the field are saying. Like Dan Siegel is a good example of that. He talks about, what happens to the brain when it's when it's being flooded with stress or stressful triggers. And I mean, either you're going to go into fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah.
And I mean, with him, he tended to go into the fight mode. Or sometimes he'd run away too, but more often than not, that was his way, and quote unquote the more acceptable way for a young boy to be able to manage his emotional overwhelm. So he would, become quite hostile and aggressive, and then of course he started to learn that wasn't okay. So then he started to shut right down, and it was like, oh, I can't have these feelings or these emotions. They're not acceptable. I can't cry. I can't show this very sensitive side. I can't wear my heart on my sleeve because God forbid I'm going to be crucified for it, or I'll be, labeled and shamed into silence. And so, over the years that did not serve him very well, even though, and so I ended up looking at mindfulness as a way to support his capacity to really be able to stay focused, to be able to self-regulate, to be able to develop a sense of self-awareness and deeper reflective capacities, so that, he had some insight into himself and into what was going on in his internal world. And so, but, back in the day, mindfulness was a pretty, what do you want to call it? It's on the fringe of being, people didn't understand it. And, a lot of parents would look at me like the granola mom who was,
She's doing what?
What is she doing? She's putting her kid on a restricted diet, or a diet that supports his brain health, and parents didn't want to learn, or even educators didn't really want to understand what I was trying to do. Their minds were closed.
Yeah.
And their capacity to embrace other ways, other perspectives around how to support healthy development for young boys and men was just not there. And I still think it's still quite limited in terms of the educational system, in terms of the mental health system, human services. It's like, it's starting to catch up to speed. And now, mindfulness is the latest novel trend, and everybody wants to jump on board. And it has its merits, but it also has its deficits, like anything else. It's not the end all for mental health issues. And I mean, so I preface it that way because there's this, I read an article, it was called McDonald's, you're thinking of McDonald's, they would call it, it was kind of the article was focusing on mindfulness in that same frame. It's like this latest franchise on how you basically tackle the mental health crisis that we have right now globally,
easy, right?
And it's like, no, mindfulness needs to be broached a little bit with kid gloves, because it's kind of like opening Pandora's box. Because if somebody does have a chronic mental health issue, they try and band-aid it with mindfulness, and they don't really know what they're doing, or they're not working with somebody that is trauma informed, which I am. If they come at a mindfulness practice with with a big trauma history or a lot of stress that they haven't really learned to face and cope and build a sense of resiliency, they could potentially, push themselves to a breaking point. So, you need to really be conscious of, okay, how people can self-regulate and how people can get themselves back to a place of feeling centered so that they can respond appropriately. Or like, Dan Siegel talks about, the frontal lobe or our executive functioning going offline when we're stressed out or when we're in a state of or we're experiencing some type of trauma. So, I think about my son, and the biggest thing that he had to deal with was a lot of bullying, growing up, and he didn't have the skills or the awareness or the capacity to cope with it. And then we're looking at a, education system that, from my perspective, it's quite broken. It isn't serving the needs of students to optimize their development. Teachers are not fully equipped to manage some of these, the behaviors and the mental health challenges. And right now, post-pandemic, all this stuff is just blossomed, tenfold. So, we have an education system that's not equipped to deal with the fallout. We have a mental health care system or a healthcare system that's not prepared to deal with the fallout. So it's like these poor kids are struggling, both male and female, but males have always kind of they fall between the cracks. They really don't get the support and the services and the understanding they need in terms of, how to tailor, educational strategies or mental health strategies to meet the needs of where men are at in terms of how their brains are wired and how they're firing, how they cope, how they're socialized. All these factors come into play when it comes to supporting somebody's optimal mental and physical well-being. And then you see the issue, what's happening when men move into leadership roles. And then it's like, okay, if you have a man who's got a trauma history or has any kind of mental health issues, and he moves into a leadership position, do you think he's going to be equipped to be an effective leader?
Well, what's interesting about this is you started out, talking about how you got into mindfulness with your son. And I think what's interesting about that is, when we talk about traumas that happen really in the adult world, not just to men, but to women as well, most traumas that occur, unfortunately, you look at the age ranges for whatever reason, it seems to be that 6, 7, 8-year-old range. Somebody has a trauma occur, and then, it doesn't hit them. And like you were saying, a man's brain may not be fully developed until they're 33. Well, my gosh, by the time you're in your 30s, you could be in your 40s and it hits you between the eyes that, wow, I'm like not living the life that I thought I was meant to live, And so, but a lot of that is occurring at such a young age. So how can we reverse some of this and help these young men when trauma is going to occur. Let's face it. Unfortunately, we can't get away from that, but how can we reverse this trend and help young boys advance into manhood more equipped?
I've often pondered that, and I think a big piece of the puzzle is these young boys are in need of really healthy male role models, and in terms of, what it means to be a healthy, well-adjusted young man. And in this day and age when, we have, so much going on in our crazy world right now, we have a significant leadership crisis that even the average man right now can't even look for good
I got
for,
nothing on that.
for a good example. You know what I'm saying? And so that's a big piece of it is creating networks of really healthy men that can
Yeah.
be mentors and role models for these young boys. And I mean, another piece of the puzzle, of course, I think is equipping teachers, educators, anyone who has any influence over the development of our young boys. And so I mean, getting teachers up to speed. I often used to talk with some of my friends and colleagues who are educators here in Canada, and I said, I almost feel like every educator needs to be trained in special ed, because special education teachers have a much greater span or width of skill set to manage and adapt to a diverse room of learners. So, I think that's a part of a strategy that could be, brought into it from a systemic perspective.
Yeah.
And I think a big piece of it too is, creating opportunities for family systems to be able to dialogue and engage with each other, So, I mean, and drawing from the collective wisdom of other families that are struggling. I mean, how often do families sit together and share their struggles in terms of parenting and raising their young boys? I mean, I think if those types of networks were created, I think that would definitely help to support families more, because they wouldn't be feeling isolated, like they're having to do this alone. There's a great book by an author called Attunement, and love the man. I sat in on a webinar recently, and he really was speaking a lot to this whole idea of building community, and I think that's why I also love supporting people in terms of their mindfulness practice, because you can build a community of people that are in practice together relative to their own mindfulness capacity. And I think in doing that, I mean, I offer a mindfulness-based stress reduction program for men online right now in collaboration with an organization called the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And, a lot of the men come out of that, one, with a lot more skill, a lot more awareness, a lot more capacity to cope, build resiliency, but they also have the support of that community of men where they can share their insights, their wisdom. They can learn what works, what doesn't work, what are their common challenges and barriers, that they're dealing with that maybe gets in the way of their practice, that gets in the way of their being able to cope effectively. So I really almost think that some of that peer support needs to be also offered for young boys, so they have a blanket of support to be able to go to and be able to learn together some of these skills, and hopefully be better equipped to be able to cope with the stressors of life, because stress never goes away.
No.
I mean, my
biggest concern, and you bring this up, and it's one of my big concerns. We do, when we have challenges on our lives, and men are exceptionally good at this, isolation. If we have a challenge, many times, rather than taking action on it, we will isolate from it, and then it just builds and builds and builds. And over time, what it tends to affect more than anything, from what I've seen, are relationships. So divorce comes into play. The relationships with their children come into play. It's not uncommon for me to say, well, I don't have much of a relationship with my children. Well, why is that? And, it as if in a lot of cases, they try to put Band-Aids over a much larger wound rather than work on the wound itself. And I think I agree with you that building communities people should be leaning into communities, but they're not, because I think people have this premonition that it reveals something about them that they don't want to be true. And actually being vulnerable in that way is really where they need to sit.
Absolutely. I think, and I think the key piece of that too is creating safe containers, so
Ooh.
people will lean into that vulnerability so that they will express, from a heart space and not a head space. Because, 80-90% of human beings, function from their head up. They're
Yep.
not connected to their body viscerally. So they don't trust the body's wisdom. They are not connected to their heart space. Because that's just too vulnerable. That's just
too real. Yeah.
It's too real to be able to speak from your heart and speak from a place of truth. And so, we've become really good at, dancing around or armoring up or distancing ourselves or just avoiding, denying, blaming, procrastinating. I mean, there's all of these ways that we choose to try to cope with difficulty that actually disconnects us from not only other people, but from ourselves.
So that's a good point. So how can we encourage men to listen to their heart and speak into their heart versus doing some of the screwy things that come out of their head?
Well, I think part of it is making space and time for stillness and silence.
Oh, yes.
Because how can you listen and pay attention to, other spaces in your being, like in terms of your heart space or in terms of trusting your gut instinct and your intuition, and with all the noise and the distraction we have in the world right now, if we don't quiet the mind, we can't pay attention to these other ways of knowing and the wisdom that we inherently have as human beings, And I truly believe, and when I coach and I do counseling with my clients, that when I support them to be able to resource within themselves, every human being has the seeds of truth and healing within them, to heal those wounds. Yeah. And it might not be the same trajectory in terms of their healing journey, but they will find, in collaboration with somebody like me that walks with them as a guide, they will find their own answers in time. And it's a bit of trial and error, seeing what works, what doesn't work. But that's why, mindfulness is a practice, That's why many things are considered a practice. Even medicine is considered a practice. When you think about it. So, and teaching is, in my opinion, a practice too. And having a marriage is a practice. Having a family is a practice. Yeah. Nobody gives us a book and a manual to, how we're going to have a healthy, enriching marriage or family. It takes time and that's why if we don't build community, how can we draw from that collective wisdom? The indigenous people had such a great insight into that because they come together in community when somebody is struggling, when somebody is suffering, and so they don't have to suffer in isolation. They don't have to feel like they have to carry the burden of their emotional wounds, their psychological wounds all by themselves, because they have that beauty, the beauty of the community to support them, to hear them, to really hear them and be present to them. Yeah. And I think that communication is a critical piece of supporting healthy relationships and learning to also work with conflict, in relationships, whether it's with our partner, our colleagues, our kids. And, it's like, it doesn't mean it needs to be a screaming match, but you also don't want to avoid conflict. Yeah. Because that doesn't solve the problem or doesn't get to the heart of what really matters. that's really going to move, people in relationship to places of forgiveness and understanding and compassion and empathy. That's not going to happen if people don't have the capacity to develop their communication.
Yeah,
And especially listening is a really critical one.
Don't you think that part of the reason that we avoid conflict is just this whole idea of, well, this is just going to come out as an argument and I don't even want to bother with it. I'm not going to tell my wife this, and this because I don't want it to end in an argument. And so ultimately what happens is you do something in silence, typically comes out later, and then the problem is, that much more monumental.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't it make more sense to just sit down and have these conversations right up front?
In my mind, that makes perfect sense, but it's, for some reason, we have learned that it's easier to avoid aversion to, and our brains are wired that way too. We want, we are drawn to pleasure and we avoid pain, right? And when we move into conflict, there's potential for pain there. There's potential for misunderstanding. There's potential for hurt feelings. There's potential for resentment, for awkwardness, awkward silence, and versus saying, or even I think there's a misperception that conflict can be the fruit of possibility. Oh. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to end in pain and distress if done with intention to repair.
Yeah, I mean, some of the biggest challenges that we face can really lead towards some of our greatest victories. And I would think that would also be true in conflict. Conflict is to a large degree unavoidable, particularly in marriage, right? I mean, we get married, you're two different people, come from two different backgrounds. It's inevitable that there's going to be some level of conflict there. But, do you really want to live that way? Or is it something that you can work through? And I'm amazed at the number of people, especially now. I'll just say the divorce rate seems extremely high to me. And it coincides with what I would call this microwave society where we want everything fast and easy. We don't want to deal with anything hard, and life, just generally speaking, doesn't work that way.
And it doesn't support resiliency.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I worked with some men coaching and counseling, and, relationships were top of mind for a couple of them. And, often I would coach them around this whole idea of not only do you want to, be resilient in and of yourself, but you also want to build capacity and resiliency in your relationship with your partner.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, as soon as there's some grievous incident or experience that happens within the context of your relationship, if you don't have that inner capacity, that resiliency, that will to persevere, then you're just going to throw away the baby with the bathwater.
Wow.
And you're just going to give up and throw in the towel. And it's like, and that's what happens is that, relationships will hit a wall at some point. And they either work through it and thrive, or the relationship dies and doesn't survive. You can't expect, a plant to live if you don't water it and you don't, give it the nutrients it needs, or to transplant it and transform it, because it's going to grow, it's going to transform over time. Same thing with relationships. You either grow together and with each other, and you uplift each other to be the best versions of yourself, or you tear each other down and you tear the relationship apart.
You just reminded me I need to water a couple plants outside. But thank you for that.
No worries.
How can we encourage? This is one of the challenges I feel like men face. Oh man, is that we've buried all this stuff, man, and we just hope. We just hope, oh dear God, I hope I never have to address this. But it feels like we always do at some point. Feels like it always comes out at some point, one way or another. Comes out. How can we address men, or how can we help men to stop burying that stuff and take a good hard look in the mirror, so that they can be the best man that they can be?
I guess you have to.
It's always great to get a woman's perspective on this too.
But it's really about supporting them to hold space for their pain and their suffering.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of courage, and you need to embrace that versus running away. That's a cowardly way of dealing with yourself and the things that matter most. And most of the time, I bet, if you interviewed 10 men, I bet you 9 out of 10 would say one of the things that they regret the most is not sticking with something and seeing it to the end.
Yeah.
And just quitting halfway. I mean, I'm working with a man right now doing some coaching. And I mean, he's dealing with stuff with his wife and in his relationship. And, I said to him, and he's big into running marathons and, he used to be a competitive ski racer. And I said, so what would happen if you're running, and he's training for this marathon. And I said, so what's going to happen if you're training for the marathon and you got the last 500 yards to go and you just quit? Are you gonna make it? Are you gonna win? Are you gonna, how, and it's the same thing like a relationship.
Yeah.
You gotta go the distance, in relationship and also in terms of supporting the relationship you have with yourself. I mean, if you have any sense of wanting to transform yourself and your life and your relationships, you can't keep on chasing the proverbial tail, as I call it, and repeating, the sins of our fathers or our mothers. You cannot continue to bring those maladaptive patterns, ways of thinking, or beliefs, and can perpetuate them. Somebody has to, basically stand into, putting a stop to it, and really saying, no, this is not functional. This is not healthy. This is not helpful. I need to change, because I don't want to be the same kind of communicator as my dad was.
Yeah.
Or I don't want to be the same kind of emotionally unavailable person as, my father or my dad or my uncle or somebody was. It's like, or whoever was their mentor and their role model. I mean, so, children tend to watch what we do more as adults versus listening to what we say. So if men don't want to model in healthy ways, then through their actions, they're going to perpetuate behaviors and ways of thinking and doing things that's going to be carried on from one generation to the next.
It's probably one of the larger problems that I see, is that we repeat things that happen to us, that happen to our fathers. There seems to be this constant repetition of, and I think of it this way. I do feel like we're at a point in our culture where we have enough science and understanding behind things to really stop this. I mean, I grew up in a generation, right, where my dad was in Vietnam and, my grandfather was in Korea, and, you had all these guys that went off to war first and foremost, and they saw things that I don't want to see. Right. And then they came back and they decided we ain't going to talk about it. So, if you decide you're not going to talk about your emotions, you're already off to a bad start. And we've grown up of eras of these types of men. And I'm not knocking these men.
No.
They saw things, they did things, and they were God-fearing men. But, in terms of meeting emotional needs in places where men needed to have emotional needs met, I don't think that has occurred. And we have generations of men that are repeating the same mistakes. And, I just see that men really, they do want to be seen and heard. They do. They do want to express their emotions, but they're kind of looking over their shoulder sometimes going, is it okay to do this? Is it okay? Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, it's that permission giving, it's okay to be real. It's okay to, to have deep sorrow and regret or to be feeling insecure or even to feel afraid. It's okay. That's the human experience.
Well, I think that's probably an excellent way to leave this podcast today. Bonnie, tell everybody, how can they get, I just love your voice, by the way. It's so calming and soothing.
All those years of practice.
How can people get a hold of you and learn more about what you're doing?
Well, they certainly can reach out to me at my website, which is www.sensusmindfulnesscoaching.com, or they can certainly email me at info@sensusmindfulness.com as well. And happy to have a conversation and set up a discovery call if somebody's interested in learning a little bit more about my services. They're struggling with their own mental health, their own emotional well-being, with their capacity, either in their relationships or even in their roles at work as leaders. Because I do work in the whole realm of, leadership consulting as well. I do, a lot of mindfulness coaching and some psychotherapeutic support for those that want to do a deeper dive. So happy to have that complimentary discovery call with folks that are interested in learning more. I do, like I said, I run a mindfulness-based stress reduction program online for men. So happy to share more about that too and see if people want to jump on board for that. So.
Well, there you go. And we'll, of course, put that in the show notes. Bonnie, thank you for being on the True Man podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah, I did too. Thank you again for your time and your interest, and look forward to connecting again.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, you too.